Okay, real quick, I just have a few quick announcements before we get started. The first one is, as many of you have contacted me, rightfully so, exam one has not been completed and grading yet. So I thank all of you for your patience. For those of you that have not received your grades yet, I have been in contact with our TAs and they will be grading them. I've told them to have it completed by the end of today, hopefully. So you should be able to expect them very soon and definitely before your next exam next week. So you can get some feedback and get a feel for how grading will proceed on future exams. Now we have a couple of questions in the email I want to just address real quickly about the equations. So you will not have to, per se, memorize the equations in the sense that you will not be asked to write any of the equations out, but you will be responsible for knowing which equation goes with which like energy transfer. So, for example, radiation. You have to be able to recognize it because if you recall from the activities, they asked you some questions about which unit or which parameter from the equation differs between the two organisms. So knowing, example, in radiation that the capital A stands for surface area, that's going to be important for the exam. But again, you will see the equations in the question. So visually they will be provided, but they will not have definitions of what they are or what the parameters in the equations are. So you do have to know those things, the parameters, and recognize the equation to the energy transfer, which one is which. You will not need to do any kind of math or calculations using those energy transfer equations. Just again, just being familiar with them. So with that, I'll go ahead and I will turn it over to the group for anybody that has any specific questions or anything they want to go over.
Yeah, so I have a question. It's just on like the study points that you gave us, 2 and 3, it says compare between different structures, postures, or behaviors on number 2. Is that kind of like on our Cogbooks thing where you match like the picture of the animal to which one, or could you like define that one a bit more?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right and on track. Those are going to be just like the activities. So when it talks about different structures, postures, or behaviors, those could be like in contact with different structures. So like, is it in contact with the ground? Is it in contact with water, possibly? Is it in contact with another organism? For as far as postures, that's going to be maybe an example would be, is the organism standing up so it has very little contact with the ground, or is it laying down and it has extended contact with the ground? And behaviors could be something like, is the organism flying? So I think we had a couple examples with the insects that a flying organism is going to experience a lot of heat transfer via convection because it's moving through the air, so there's a lot of air transfer. Or is the organism basking in the sun, right? It's going to obtain a lot of energy via radiation. Or is it swimming in the water? Again, that would be evidence of convection. So those kinds of behaviors we can look for. Then
Okay, perfect. So I'm assuming that's kind of the same thing on 3, just for the equations themselves, not just the heat flux labels.
yeah, exactly. So it's just like the activities where you had to like describe them and match them to radiate the word radiation per se, and then the next activity set was you had to match it to the equation for radiation or convection. So yeah, 2 and 3 are exactly the same, but just going from the words to the equations.
Okay, perfect. And my last question was in the cog books themselves, one of the questions was compare basically it was like a dark, completely black jaguar to like a spotted one. And the answer said um a challenge question. The jaguars are approximately the same size and likely have the same body temperature. Therefore, these jaguars will emit a similar amount of radiation, although the jaguar with the darker fur will absorb more radiation. Based on the question, it said identify which part of the equation is happening here. To me, it essentially says that it's the same. So I was just wondering if I'm reading that correctly or.
I don't have it in front of me, so my initial hunch is, I do remember the problem you're talking about. So that's with the radiation equation, correct?
Correct.
So that, did they in the answer say that it was the like the E looking symbol, emissivity?
No, they didn't include anything other than what I just said. It just said
Ah,
challenge
okay.
question,
So
exclamation point.
it's missing the answer essentially is what you're getting at, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, so the answer would be emissivity. That the symbol for that.
Okay.
It kind of looks like an E. I forget what the symbol is actually called, but it's in defined in cognitive.
Got you.
Yeah, because they talk
Awesome. Yeah,
about
because there was
body
another question.
temperature. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, there was also another one later with like two snakes the same way, and it doesn't really clarify on that one either. It just kind of says that one will absorb better, but is that kind of the same thing that we're talking about? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're good. These are great questions because some of them, because the way to approach these is not, there's not going to be any one single absolute 100% correct answer. Think of it in terms of which is the best answer, which has the most effect in the equation, which parameter, or which heat flux has the most transfer. Because these heat fluxes don't occur individually, usually, they don't occur in a vacuum. Usually you have multiple heat fluxes occurring at once. So we can just think of in term, you could probably make arguments like if we have an animal laying on the ground, but also in the sun, right? There's conduction happening by touching the ground, while simultaneously, if it's in the sun, it's absorbing radiation. So, we can just think of it's almost a process of elimination in the activities, which is the best answer given these choices. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it does.
What is the snake one? I do want to look at that one because I'm not recalling that one. Can you tell me
Mm,
which activity it is? Like
yes.
we can look at
It
it.
is module 5 for
Yep.
sure. And then I believe it's like, hold on, I'm pulling it up. I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries. I'll look through it too a little bit. And if anybody else knows offhand, feel free to chime in. But the Jaguar one I
I know
remember.
it's like later.
Okay.
It's in the ones where like you actually type in an answer.
Okay.
So one of the feedback ones.
Okay, so I think I found it. I'm gonna share my screen. So can we all see my screen with the pictures of the two snakes right now?
Yes, I
Okay,
can.
and is this the one you're talking about?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is very similar to the jaguar, I think. So this is assuming both organisms experience the same body temperature. So T in that equation is constant. The Boltzmann equation is constant. Um, we can't really tell their size, so I would say it's fairly safe to assume surface area is constant. So then this is going to be, I would argue this would be emissivity again, would be different because emissivity is the level of absorption of radiation, and that differs by color. Darker objects tend to have higher values of emissivity and they absorb more radiation than light colored organisms. And I think we can all kind of relate to this if we wear a black shirt in the sun versus if we wear a white shirt in the sun. We notice we get warmer by wearing that black shirt because it absorbs more radiation.
Perfect. Yeah, that makes sense. Just like I said, based on the other question, I didn't know exactly which one we were looking at, but that totally makes sense. Thank you for explaining.
Yeah, I don't know why this doesn't have the word emissivity in the answer. I mean, it describes it conceptually, like it'll gain more heat by absorbing radiation, but they did not give an explicit answer, so that's a very fair question here.
Cool. That's all my questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem.
I was hoping you could go over in T6 in the case study. There's a couple graphs at the beginning, and I understand the concept that they display, but I don't understand how to read the graphs. It's the ones that talk about how the abiotic factors interact together.
Yep. Sorry, I'm just opening the video. Okay, I'll open it and let me. So is it the temperature and moisture figure?
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
I guess I just don't understand like how the curve relates to fitness when neither of the axes. If you could just explain that.
Sure. So it's a little more, it's like a three-dimensional figure essentially is what this is. So on the x-axis, we have temperature, right? It increases from left to right. It gets warmer as we go to the right. On the y-axis, we have moisture that goes from low to high. And then it has three bins essentially, or areas on this curve. They don't explain how they fit these fitness curves. That's part of these studies over on the side here. I think the important part is to look at the relationships of, like, if we drew a line anywhere here, we could predict the fitness. And there was a lot of math that went into this that wasn't explained. So that's not, figuring out how to put the curves on there is not important for this class. That goes beyond what we're doing. But like you said, interpreting this is important. So if we drew a line, underneath this curve, we would have fitness less than 0. So they're not doing well in this area. Fitness greater than 0 is if we drew a curve and they ended up over here with these parameters. So say, for instance, we're right here. That's what, 25 degrees with 11% humidity. That's going to allow the organisms to survive to some extent. So anywhere in this area is going to have some fitness so they can survive and reproduce. This top one, this is where fitness is much greater than 0. So essentially that just means high levels of fitness, right? So if the abiotic factors happen to be in here, so about what, 28 degrees and 13% humidity, that would produce, really good abiotic conditions and allow these organisms, these weevils, to have really high levels of fitness. Versus anything down here with low levels of moisture, pretty much at any temperature, you're going to have low levels of fitness or no fitness at all. So we can maybe conclude that moisture is a very strong driving factor in this, stronger actually than temperature. Because again, you could have any temperature with low levels of moisture, low levels of fitness. They need to have something over 10 to have any level of fitness, but then there's a little bit of boundary on the edges of, there's a range of optimal temperatures and a minimum for fit moisture. Does that make a little more sense?
I see. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. So it's not about the line. The line was just breaking apart the spaces on the graph to like predict what the fitness would be.
Yeah, so I mean the lines are
in that
important,
space.
but they don't
Okay.
describe how to put them on there. That's a third dimension to this graph, is adding fitness. So you have 3 areas of different levels of fitness that are dependent on the interaction of these 2 abiotic factors.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
No problem. Good question. Are there any other specific questions? If not,
I had a
go
question
ahead.
from one of my peers wanted to ask about question number 5 on the study guide,
Sure.
which talks about the aquatic plants challenges acquiring carbon dioxide.
Yeah,
And I think she was hoping you could just expand on exactly what you wanted for an answer there.
sure. So what is a challenge that aquatic plants face?
Her initial response was being in an anaerobic environment.
Yeah, so what do plants breathe in? Let's back it up even further.
Carbon dioxide.
Yeah, and it's in the question, right? So the challenge is, how do plants, they struggle to obtain carbon dioxide in sometimes hypoxic environments. Is it easy or difficult for carbon dioxide to go into water?
It's difficult, right?
Yeah, so there's generally more concentration of carbon dioxide in the air than there is in water. And plants that are aquatic are in the water, right? So they need to draw it out of that water. And how do they do that?
respiration through pores on their leaves, right?
Yeah, so they can draw straight carbon dioxide into themselves from the water. But if there's low levels of carbon dioxide in the water, that can be kind of limiting. So how does carbon dioxide combine with water? Is it always just pure carbon dioxide, or does it potentially change into other molecules?
It depends on the pH of the water, right?
Yeah, sometimes it can be turned into carbonic acid, it described, right? So the plant can absorb carbonic acid, and then internally it can break it down, and one of the byproducts of that would be CO2. So it can draw straight CO2, it can draw carbonic acid, and then produce CO2. So it has multiple ways of obtaining CO2 for this one. And that's part of the photosynthesis, right? Of absorbing CO2 and producing glucose and oxygen, right? So, and part of the byproduct of the carbonic acid could also be oxygen too. So it kind of is the breakdown of these other molecules is going to be how it actually gets what it needs to perform photosynthesis.
Kind of piggybacking off of that, do you think we can go over number 4 on the study guide?
Yeah, you can do that. Let me pull it back up. Okay, so this is contrast the strategies that freshwater animals and saltwater animals use to osmoregulate. So the way to think about this is we can talk about freshwater fish or freshwater animals versus saltwater animals, but let's think about them each individually first. What is a challenge that a freshwater fish faces in its environment? In terms of osmoregulation.
It's hyperosmotic because it has too many solutes relative to the water, right?
Well, if we're in freshwater, so it faces not too many solutes, it faces a problem of too few solutes because there's too much water in its environment.
Right. So
Yeah.
the water would be I'm sorry.
So it'd be hypoosmotic, right? Because it doesn't have enough. How do fish deal with having excess water and too few ions or salts? How do they get rid of excess water?
Don't they have to what is it? They have to excrete it more within like their urine and their gills. They have to remove it from there. Is that
Yeah. So the simple answer is they just get rid of it as waste, right? They pee out excess water. But when water goes into the bladder, is it the only thing that's in there? Is the bladder contain pure water?
no?
Yeah, it contains some ions too, right? So what can they do before they excrete the water with those ions? They can reabsorb them, right? If the animal is freshwater and has kidneys, it'll use its kidneys to draw the ions out of the bladder and leave the water and put the ions back into its body. So then when it pees, it'll be very dilute and very much water. For fish, they can actually do that in their gills, where they can pull ions out of the water into their gills. So depending on if the organism, is freshwater mammal versus a freshwater fish, it kind of does the same thing, but in different places. What about saltwater animals now? What is the problem that they face?
They have lower solute concentrations in their tissues that exist in the surrounding water.
Yeah, well, their problem is they have too much water, right? Or no, they have too. Sorry, this is saltwater. My bad. they have too many ions and not enough water. So yes, what you said is correct. So how do they go about it? In a similar way that the freshwater animals, they just face the opposite problem, right? What are some of the physiological mechanisms or the adaptations that they have for dealing with this issue? So
in the same sense, they would excrete those ions through like their urine.
yeah, so they drink a lot of salt water to get water, but as we know, salt water in the name comes with salt and ions, so they have to excrete those ions. So when it goes into their bladder, rather than reabsorbing the ions, they excrete or extract the water back into their body, so they have very concentrated urine. And that's why a lot of saltwater animals produce things like ammonia or other types of acids in their waste because it's very concentrated to get rid of the excess ions. They can also do things like eating their food, do a very similar thing. Food tends to have water in it. They consume that food, get rid of the excess ions and absorb the water and maintain that.
Okay.
And they can also use certain osmotic pathways, right? They can use active transport because that goes against the gradient where they can draw in specific ions and remove other ions.
Okay. I do have like a weird, kind of not related question as far as that concerned. These ions, they're the way, so the way that I work in the vet industry and the way that I'm thinking about this, like a blockage essentially. I don't know why, but I am. So there's no possible way that there would be like too much of an ion for these animals to excrete, and they wouldn't have like, what kind of problems would they have if they're unable to excrete them, essentially, is what I'm trying to ask.
Sure, that's a good question. And there can be too many ions that can lead to death of an animal. If we have too much salt in our system, any animal, that can lead to complications because then it leads to different pathways that need a minimum threshold of, say, like the sodium potassium pumps. If you have tons of sodium but no potassium, you're not going to be able, those pumps aren't going to function properly, and it can lead to shutdown of entire organ systems, and lead to failure of reproduction, lead to death. So yeah, you can, it's not necessarily, I'm not sure blockage is the right word for that, but it just disrupts equilibrium and it disrupts multiple systems that can lead eventually, like I said, to organ failure and can lead to death.
Okay. I know I get exactly where you're coming from. I think I just got caught on like the whole like salt content, and that, to me, thinking of salt just made me think of grit, and I don't know why that made me think of a blockage, but what you're saying makes a lot more sense.
That's fair, but it got you on the right thought process. So I mean, it got you pretty close, I would say.
Well, thank you.
No problem. Anybody else have anything specifically wanted to bring up?
I do have one more. In T8, there's some questions where you have to calculate there's questions at the end, calculate the number of offsprings the parent is likely to have. And I was able to like intuitively figure it out, but I was hoping you could work through an example.
Sure. Why don't we can go through, I think there's 4 activities. We should be able to walk through all of them quick, not too long. Okay, so for this first one, it kind of starts off a little slow, which I think it was good build for us. So we just look at the chart here. We have energy invested per offspring measured in kilojoules. That is a unit of energy. And then we have survivorship on the y-axis ranging from 0 to 1, right? So 0 is they don't survive, 1 is maximum survivorship. And then this question asks us, what is the minimal amount of energy that a female can invest in her offspring? So we have to, for this one, we have to look at the x-axis and we see where does this line hit the x-axis? And that's simply, right, it doesn't go all the way to 0, it goes to 30. So that's the minimum amount of energy she can invest in an individual offspring. Does that one make sense?
Yes.
Okay. And then the second one, it says, what is the survivorship of an offspring with 100 kilojoules of energy? So we can go to the x-axis, and what we do is we find 100, because that's what the mother invested into this offspring, and we draw a line up, and we see where it hits the survivorship curve. And then to know what its survivorship is, we have to go over to the left here, and somewhere over here about 0.5, let's say. And then that is, yeah, that's what we got for our answer here. So that's how we find the energy that was invested in that individual, knowing how much, or that's how we find the survivorship, rather, sorry, knowing the energy invested. And then to calculate some of the other stuff, what does it ask you? So now it gives us a little bit different information. So it says she has 1,000 kilojoules of energy available for reproduction. How many offspring, how many offspring of the optimal size could she produce? So now we're looking to calculate the number of offspring, and we know that she has 1,000. So what is the first step in determining this answer? Where are we looking on the curve?
The x-axis.
Why would you say the
No.
x-axis?
Because we're given an energy value.
Okay, that's fair. What is the energy value we're given?
It's her total energy value, which
Yeah.
is different than the x-axis, right? So I
Yeah.
assume I have to do some calculation, but I'm not quite understanding how I do that.
That's fair. No, I mean, because it is the same units. An initial look there is good, but when we read the axes, as you pointed out, they are different. So this is when she has a total. So the first thing we want to look at on this plot is where this curve stops increasing. And so essentially where it kind of starts going in the negative direction, right? Because in the beginning it's going up, and then it has an inflection point, and then it goes in the opposite direction, and eventually it would plateau. And if we kept going, we would even see it go down and create kind of a bell curve. So what we need to do though here is we need to find that inflection point. So it's going to be somewhere, I would say in here is where the curve really starts to shift. And then where it shifts, we do use the x-axis. So we find that inflection point, we draw our invisible line or a real line down, and that's about 100. That's the energy invested per individual offspring. And if she has 1,000 total available, we take that 1,000 and divide it by that 100. And that's where we get the number 10.
Okay, so you're going to where the slope significantly stops like increasing.
Yeah, so if we were to draw a straight tangent line, right in this general direction, where would the flat line hit this curve, which is also called the inflection point? Yeah, so that's really important. Find that inflection point and then draw down, and then the total divided by whatever this number is. Because I think this next question is the same, but it's different numbers, so we can practice it again. Where would we say, so this is assuming a female again has 1,000 kilojoules of energy in her eggs, which of the following clutch sizes would be the closest to optimum? So where would we call the inflection point for this question?
I mean, maybe 250. I'm having a hard time because I feel like I'm just kind of guessing where the point would be.
It is a little subjective. I agree with that. So again, we want to find if we drew a straight line where it would hit. And it would be somewhere in this general vicinity, right? So if we drew it down here, we could say 200. If 250 would be somewhere up here. That looks like, to me, that might be a little past the inflection point. So if we back up maybe around here and hit, then we have 200 as our value. So 1,000 divided by 200 is 5. And it's not the easiest thing to see without being able to physically draw on there. But what we could do,
Yeah, like maybe if I had a ruler.
yeah, no, honestly, a ruler would be very helpful because you could see where that, where that flat line is, and you could, do it on your computer screen. It's a little clunky, but if some people are hands-on visual learners like myself, I would like having a ruler that I could put on the screen for that. But alternatively, if you have the equation, you could plug in the answer a few different times and see where that would kick out, right? So if we plugged in 10, that would kick out somewhere down here. If we plugged in 15, it would kick out somewhere up here, right? So we would know those aren't likely inflection points. They're too high. So a lower value would be 5, somewhere more in the middle.
Okay, so maybe working backwards is a better way to do that.
Yeah, there's 2 ways you could approach it. You could look for the answer and do the calculation, or you're given 4 choices down here. You could plug those in as the answer and back calculate for the basically you're given 2 pieces of information and asking to solve for the third, right? So you could go in either direction.
Okay.
What is the last one? So that, yeah, again, so this is a similar idea. So you have 1,000 kilojoules of energy again to invest in the eggs. Which is the following clutch sizes would you be closest to optimum? So where would we think the inflection point might be on this line?
At 50, right? So that'll
Yeah, so-
be 20.
If we draw a line up from 50, it's somewhere kind of in the middle. If we drew it up from 100, we know that's too far. We can't draw it below here. So it has to be above, what is this, 30? Yeah, so I would agree that it's, 50 seems to be somewhere in the middle. 1,000 divided by 50, that's our 20. That make a little bit more sense on how to approach these?
Yeah, I think I don't know if it's my eyesight or just me struggling to read the graphs. But I think working backwards is probably a good solution for me on that as well. So
Okay. Yeah, and either one will get you to the answer, so. Assuming it's multiple choice, right? Because if this were to be like written in a short answer version, these wouldn't be here. But what you're going to see on the exam is you're going to see similar questions like these activities in multiple choice. So. Then there are a few activities that if the group wants, I'm interested in going over just to kind of explain a little bit and like how to approach them. We talked about this is going back not to the energy flux equations, but I still think this is kind of an important process, right? Because we have 3 choices, or we have 3 images here, and we have 3 choices for the energy flux. And as I mentioned earlier, if we look at each one, we can make arguments probably for all of them. So the way to think about it is what is the best answer, right? So for this first one, we have the snake here. About maybe a third to half of its body is exposed to radiation. So that seems like a good choice. But also on the bottom, there's a third to half of the body touching in contact with the ground. So, that could be conduction is a possible good choice. And convection, that's going to be in contact with some sort of fluid. So like the wind blowing or water is always a good example. We don't really see any evidence in the picture of it being windy, and there's no evidence that it's in water. So I would argue convection would be the weakest argument for this one. And we could say it's either radiation or conduction. And it could, honestly, it could probably go either way in this picture. So maybe we hold that thought and we move to the next picture. So we look at this, we're looking at corals that live in the ocean. So we know that corals are in water. I don't see, you know, the sun, it's lit up, so the sun's kind of out, right? So there's probably some evidence of radiation, so that's possible. Convection, it's in water, so it's completely submerged, so convection is going to be a very high impact in this scenario. And conduction is contact, and they're touching each other a little bit, but there's not a whole lot of contact. So I would argue here that convection is our strongest choice by far. And again, that leaves us with this one that could be either conduction or radiation. So we ruled out the one we didn't think it was. And now we have this third picture where we have what I think is a robber fly on this leaf. So we have evidence of radiation because it's sunny out, so there's some sunlight possibility. There's a lot of surface area facing that. Again, about 1/3 to half of its body is facing the sun, so there's high level of radiation. There is conduction happening, right? It's got feet, so it's touching this leaf, but the amount of surface area that it's actually touching is very low. So I would argue conduction there is very low. So radiation is the best answer there. And then that leaves conduction over here, which we said was a good answer. But now we can argue, by process of elimination, that's that, the answer is conduction. And, that's correct. So I just like to point out, that's the thought process that I suggest we take when given these questions on the exam, because again, you're going to see an image, given some choices, and just we can think through each individual choice and rule out obvious wrong answers, and then decide on what is the best answer for that question. Not necessarily what is the only answer, but just, again, the best or the strongest effect.
Would we be able to do that activity but with loss instead of gain?
Loss instead of, which activity is that?
Like the picture, like what you just went over, but instead of gaining, it's either conduction, radiation, if losing it instead of gaining it.
Was it a specific one?
No, not specific. I think they were alternating this. So I think one of them, like the one with the snake, the bug, and the coral. I think the one right after that, I think, is loss. Loss is just
So the first three, activity, heat flux, A, B, and C, that's just dragging the name to it says drag elements and drop them in the corresponding boxes. So that's not gain or loss necessarily. But there's a lot of activities, so we can find what we're talking about. Oh, okay, so heat loss, it's kind of a combination. I think I found what you're looking for. Let me share my screen again. All right, so it says right here, which equation describes the primary source of heat lost by an organism? So it combines the energy flux processes with the equation. So we have to know what these equations are now, right? And it asks specifically to relate them to loss as you described.
yeah.
Right. So this is where you will have to, on the exam, we have to know what these are. What is this first equation even, which heat flux is this describing?
Hold on 1 second. I'm pulling my notes up.
Sure.
So that one where it's HA is for convection.
Yeah, and that again, we said this typically has to do with wind or water, right? And then the second one, what is this one with A, emissivity, the Boltzmann constant, and T for temperature?
That is radiation.
Yep, and then this Ka, body temperature minus ground temperature over L.
Conduction.
Yeah, that's conduction, so that's contact with the some sort of object, right? And then this one is with the E,
That is evaporation.
yeah. Right, because we can think of that as evaporative, the vapor pressure of water in the body versus vapor pressure in the air for EW and EA. Okay, so let's just describe what's happening in this first photo. The top left.
It looks like a bee is flying towards a plant.
Yeah, it's flying towards a plant. So how would this bee lose heat per se?
I would assume it's losing heat by like using its energy to flap its wings, essentially.
Yeah, so if it's flying, right? And it's using its wings and it's flapping them, what is that doing for the organism? What do we have an idea of which heat flux that would be?
I would put that under convection
I would agree with you. And why would we say convection again?
because that has to do with either air or water.
Yeah, so the animal is moving through the air, and typically when we move through the air, like we ride a bicycle or ride in a convertible, the air that we move through is cooler than the organism, so we lose heat to that movement of air, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I would agree with all of that. And then this next picture, what do we got? We got two lions in the picture. They're laying on the ground. It's daylight. So another way to think of this is like we can list off all the evidence that we see related to heat fluxes, right? So we see laying down, what evidence is that heat flux immediately?
I would think that would be conduction.
Yeah, right, because they're laying against the ground, so they're in contact with the ground, so there's evidence of conduction. The sun is out, right? So there's evidence of light, so there's evidence of radiation transfer there, right?
Yes, but not entirely because technically they're in the shade.
Yep.
Only the little paws are out in the sun.
Yeah, so that gives some weak evidence for radiation, some stronger evidence for conduction. Is there any evidence of water or wind in the picture?
No.
Yeah, so we can probably rule out convection, which we already thought was a good explanation for the first one. And then evaporation. Is there any evidence of evaporation here?
No.
So what do we think this would be?
I would go with conduction for sure.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We can put this one up here. And then what are we looking at here?
So I want to say evaporation. I understand that you've got like sorry. I do understand that you possibly have the sun radiating on that. Okay, so that can signify. Sorry. Okay.
No worries.
Signify radiation as well. But I think that within the other picture, you don't have as much evaporation than you would with the snow physically melting.
Sure, and another thing to think about radiation that I haven't mentioned or yet in the group is we mainly think of radiation coming from the sun because that's the strongest form of radiation kind of on the planet, right? But with radiation, you can have radiation without the sun because all objects radiate some heat. You mentioned snow, right? So this is presumably a cold environment, and these are plants. And these plants are blooming in the snow. Now, is that common for plants?
No, that wouldn't be a common place.
Yeah, right. Plants don't usually bloom in the snow. So for them to bloom, I believe this is skunk cabbage or something in that family. I kind of wish they would tell us what the photos actually are. Because if you just look up skunk cabbage, we know that that plant actually is kind of somewhat endothermic. It produces heat and it can bloom in cold temperatures like this. So knowing that knowledge, if this is a plant that is warm and producing heat, how is it likely losing its heat to the environment? Because that's what the question was asking us, right? Heat loss. How is it losing heat to the environment?
I mean, I have no idea. I would probably, now that's making me think radiation because it's like,
Yeah, I would agree. Like when a human, us, when we go outside in winter, we lose heat via radiation to the environment, right?
yeah,
A plant can do the same thing in a cold environment. And then this is, evaporation. If it was a warm environment, I would argue that the plant could possibly lose to evaporation. So, we have stronger evidence for radiation, maybe a little evidence for evaporation. But before we answer it, we could say maybe radiation for now. We can switch it, but let's look at the evidence in this last picture before we make our final decision. So we have jockeys riding horses here. What evidence of heat transfer do we have?
I mean, you have heat transfer directly from the horses to the people that are riding them. The
Sure, so
horses,
there's conduction, right? So you could say that, like, we could move this possibly if we have a strong enough argument.
yeah. And then you also have radiation because the sun is shining on both of them.
Sure. But we can technically argue radiation for all four photos, right? These are all living animals or objects or plants. So it's living objects, they're going to radiate some level of heat at some point in the environment.
Yeah. You could also say convection because it looks like they're running and they
Yeah.
have,
I would agree with that. What about evaporation? Is there any evidence of evaporative heat loss in here?
I mean, if I don't really feel like you can see it, but if your people possibly are like sweating or if the horses are reducing their heat by running, but again, that would be more convection than evaporation.
Be some convection, but this right here, this white stuff, it kind of looks like almost paste on the horse.
Yeah.
This is sweat. And there's around the neck here, these horses are sweating. And on their mouth, there's some foam. Like, it's not the best picture, I agree there. But this is the only real evidence I would say of evaporative heat loss, because the horses are running, so we know they're warm. We know that they're endotherms, that they're generally warmer than their environment, and then they do sweat. I mean, that's kind of a lot of assumed knowledge, which is why I don't like this example particularly, but knowing that now, that they are actively running and actively sweating, they're using that sweat to evaporatively cool, and here it is evaporative heat loss.
Okay, that makes sense. I think it was just harder to see because of the picture.
I agree. Yeah, I wish they would give a little bit of a description, just saying like a flying bee, lions laying on the ground, or something, or skunk cabbage blooming in winter. Because also, like, yeah, we can say that's snow, but who knows? It could be cotton. I mean, just to play the other side, it could be a little more descriptive in their examples, and it could be running horses that are sweating, right? But then maybe they don't want to give away all the evidence, so it's kind of a give and take, I feel. But no, this was a good example to go through, I think.
In that same chapter, when it talks about radiation for the first time, it talks about how it increases with the fourth power. Are we gonna be able, or are we gonna be using that equation in
Not
any way?
not in a mathematical sense, like you won't have to calculate anything to the fourth power, but knowing what T to the fourth power is, like verbally, knowing that that's the body temperature, that's going to be important.
Okay.
Yeah, the only math you're really going to have to do is what we went through earlier, where you're going to have to calculate like how many offspring would be optimal given X amount of energy. So that's the only real math calculations you're going to have to do in this for this exam. Because there was another section I did want to go over that has numbers, but it's not. There's no calculations. It's more like just looking for the optimal number. Here, I'll share my screen and explain and visually. But first, why don't we go over some of the selection modes too? Like, why don't we go through these 4 activities and it'll get us to this optimal phenotype that some people emailed questions about too. So this is asking about, so what do we have on these axes? We have phenotypic value on the x-axis, and it doesn't even give us numbers here. It just, we can assume it goes from low to high, and then it has relative fitness on the y-axis, and that goes from 0 to 100, and 100 or 1 rather is just the optimal maximum fitness. And this is asking about selection. So what were the 3 modes of selection? I guess it shows us down here, right? We have stabilizing, directional, and disruptive. We all recall those, right?
Yeah.
And this is asking us, using a graph, how do we identify them? So what is the one in the top left here, and why?
That one's negative selection because it's going in the negative direction.
Yeah, so negative directional selection, right? Because what we're seeing is, as the phenotypic value increases, relative fitness decreases. So pretty straightforward. And then what about this one? What's the pattern we're seeing here?
Would that be your positive directional?
Yeah, exactly, right? Because we have, as phenotypic value increases, so does relative fitness. We have a positive slope, so it's directionally positive. And this one was the opposite, we're directionally negative. Now what's going on with this one on the bottom left?
That
So
would be this stabilizing, right?
Yes, I agree. And why is this stabilizing? And kind of let's describe, what do we mean by stabilizing?
It's moving toward like a central average.
Yeah, so it's moving towards, if we think about phenotypic values, it's moving towards like the middle, right? So a medium-sized phenotypic value, it's stabilizing around the middle. The extremes at the low and the high end, it's moving away from those. So stabilizing. And then we have, the last one is disruptive, right? How do we describe disruptive selection like we just described stabilizing?
It favors the extremes on either end.
Yeah, so it'll favor the extremes. It'll favor low phenotypic values have high fitness, intermediate values have low fitness, and high values have high fitness. So we have 2 value ranges that have relatively high fitness and 1 range that has lower fitness. Versus here, we have the opposite, right? We have 1 value or kind of range that has maximizes fitness, and then at either of the extremes, it reduces fitness. So this is kind of the same thing. Why don't we just go through real quick to make sure we're on the same page? What is the top left one doing? What type of selection is that?
Disruptive.
Yeah, because where do we see the highest levels of fitness related to phenotypic values?
At either extreme.
Yeah, exactly. Low levels, intermediate levels are low fitness, and high levels are high fitness. And then what is this one right here in the top right?
I would say stabilized for that one.
Yeah, I would agree too, for the reasons we talked about, right? At low phenotypic values, we have low fitness, intermediate, we have high fitness, and at high values, we again have low fitness. So it's going to push towards the middle to kind of stabilize it around the central value. And then which direction are we going here for relative fitness? Are we going positive or negative in this chart?
Positive.
Yeah, right. So that's just positive because as both values are going up together. And then the last one is going to be negative directional, right? Because the values are as phenotypic value goes up, relative fitness goes down. Now, granted, this is kind of a messy plot, but I think we can see, you know, there's no values here and there's values down here, so it is going to be somewhat negative. But that's, you know, using real data, it's not always going to be clean. All right. So if we go into this one, what's different here? The difference is it gives us actual values, right? On the x-axis. This one ranges from 0 to 50. This one ranges from 14 to 19, 0 to 50, and 0 to 50. So now what I want to clarify for these is the values don't really mean anything. They're kind of just placeholders, they're subjective. But if we want to think about this in an applied sense, what could a phenotypic value stand for on the x-axis? What would a real world example be of a phenotypic value? What's a phenotype that we could describe?
Phenotype is like physical attributes, like eye color, hair length, things like that.
Yeah. Phenotype could be body mass, antler length, right? So we could think of it, it could be anything, right? This could be body mass right here. At low levels of body mass, we have really high fitness. And at high levels of body mass, we have low levels of fitness. So that's what, you know, that could just be an example. Or like I said, antler size of deer, you know, say they're 14 inches tall, that has low relative fitness. And if they're 19 inches tall, they have high relative fitness. So it could be anything, but I just wanted to kind of put an example out here so we can kind of more know what we're talking about. But now to get to answer these questions, it asks us to drag the elements and drop them into the corresponding boxes. So, and what that is asking is what phenotypic value on the x-axis is going to produce the greatest fitness? That's the question that it's posing. So for box A, what phenotypic value has the greatest fitness? So we look at the y-axis and we want to be up here at the highest level of fitness, but we want to correlate that to the x-axis. Where on the x-axis do we have the highest dots on the plot?
That would be 0.
Yeah, so it'd be close to 0, the lowest levels possible. So, right, and we do have 0 as a choice. So I'd agree that that would be a good choice. Now, what about this one? Where do we see, what phenotypic value do we get the highest level of fitness at?
Greater than 19.
Yeah, right. So the fitness, it's this general area of the plot. That's the highest fitness. And then that's going to come down here. So yeah, greater than 19. Exactly. What about this plot? Where do we see the highest relative fitness in correlation to the x-axis?
$22.
Yeah, so it's obviously it's this general area. If we go down, it's gonna be somewhere around 20, maybe a little to the right. 22 seems like the best answer. And then what about this one? Because this was, remember, this was directional up top, stabilizing, and now this is our disruptive selection. Where do we see the highest phenotypic value in relation to fitness?
That one would be about 50.
I agree. But what about making the argument over here on the left? Why isn't it like 0?
Because you have like you have an extra dot on your 1.0 all the way up to your 50, literally right underneath the letter D. You have a value that's high.
Yeah, these dots right here, right? And if we look at the plot, the tip of this plot is a little bit higher than the tip of this plot, right? Or the point of the plot, rather, sorry. So yeah, so it would be, even though you have high fitness on the left side and low fitness in the middle, you have the highest fitness over on the right. So the higher phenotypic values are, in this case, actually better than low phenotypic values, and then intermediate are the worst. So you can order it kind of like 1, 2, 3. Yeah, we were correct. And what about, what is this last one next? Okay, so this is the same exact thing. So let's go through this one. We can do it kind of quick because but just to make sure that we have, good understanding. So where would be what phenotypic value for A would produce the greatest fitness?
Less than 135.
Yeah, over here on the left, right? Yeah, so we could use that one. And then what about here? Where would we estimate that to be the highest fitness in relation to the phenotypic value?
That would be 44.
Yeah, so somewhere in the middle, obviously, drop it down. It's gonna be somewhere around 45. 44 is very close to that. That's our answer. And then this one, we have directional, right? That moves to the right. We have increased fitness. So we know it's the right side of the curve. Drop down, maybe somewhere around 12. That's our best answer. Fitness increases, then decreases, right? So we know that it's an intermediate value. So this is, again, our stabilizing. Drop it down somewhere around 68. And that's our last choice. So that's how we work through finding the optimal phenotype. Do you guys have any questions or concerns about these 4 exercises? You will see similar questions and plots on the exam to this.
Is it gonna be the same type of matching with multiple plots, or is it gonna be like one plot and what's the optimal phenotype?
It'll be either multiple choice or true false, so it will not be matching like this. But with multiple choice, you might get 1 plot and 4 choices, and then you pick which one. Or if it's true false, it would just say, true false, the optimal phenotype for B is 60. And when we would say false because we know that it's 44. So why don't we stay in that unit for a little bit longer here and back up. So we went over the optimal phenotypes, but when we mentioned that was all concerning natural selection, what are all the modes of selection that were talked about in that unit? We know natural selection is one because we've already discussed that in some detail now. But what were the other modes of selection? Or not the other modes of selection, the other modes of adaptation, I should say.
Are you talking about like genetic drift and mutation and
Yes.
migration?
Yep, exactly. So let's just go through those 3 topics and describe what they are. What is genetic drift? And let's maybe give an example of how it might occur.
Genetic drift would be like the random fluctuation of allelic frequency due to just random causes.
I agree with that. What would be an example of a random cause for the change in allelic frequency? So I have an example then, I guess, if we want to talk about. Say we have an island with 100 organisms, and say it's one species of bird, and they have 2 different beak sizes, this large and small, and it's about 50-50 on the island. So there's some good mixture on the island. And then there's a random storm that comes through that island like a hurricane, and say it kills 80 of those individuals. That's kind of the random chance. It could be any kind of natural disaster, like a volcanic eruption, fire, disease. So something that is not super common that comes through and disrupts the population. So we have a storm that came through and it killed 80 out of our 100 birds. And out of the survivors, 19 have large beaks and 1 has a small beak. What direction do you think, I guess, that island is going to go towards? What allelic drift would we see if it, assuming that island of that population recovers and starts breeding again?
Positive directional selections, because the beaks are gonna get bigger.
Well, I mean, I think I worded that wrong. We don't want to think in terms of selection because that's not a continuous selection pressure. So let's back up. It killed 80, 19 had large, and 1 has a small. That was the random chance that changed that allelic variation. It used to be 50-50, now it's 19-1. So odds are it is gonna, we can say it's gonna move in the direction of large beaks, but that population drifted through genetic drift to having large beaks in the population. If we looked at another population on the mainland, we might still see 50-50. And we look at an island and we go, why is that island population so far for large beaks? And we can kind of merge these and think there's 2 possible answers, right? One is that it was genetic drift because of some random event, but it could also be a selection pressure, right? If the island has different selection pressures, say there's a different predator on there or a different food source that only large beaks can crack, but on the mainland, there's multiple food choices that large or small beaks could crack. The island is going to tend towards, the directionally be selected towards the large beaks, where the mainland selection pressure is weak, and you can have either beak sizes there. So does that make sense, distinguishing between selection and genetic drift? I know we kind of merged them together, but they are different. Or did I make that more confusing?
I think it makes sense. It's just sometimes hard to attribute something to random when there's so many factors at play.
Yes, and it's usually large events like that, like something that's catastrophic to the population and makes it a very small population, and then the survivors determine the allelic frequency. So that's another way to think of drift. Selection is always, and again, it's like the energy flux equations. These pressures, like selection and drift, they don't tend to operate in a vacuum. They're going to face multiple adaptation processes. So, but sometimes you can pick out if it was selection or if it was drift based on what happened to that island. Or that whatever that population, you don't have to think of it as an island. My brain just goes there sometimes. So what is a mutation then? And how does that occur and affect adaptation?
So a mutation is basically like a random trait that affects the genotype of certain like animals at a time, or certain anything, I guess. And it will affect different and future generations based off of what type of mutation it is.
Mm-hmm. How does it
so
affect future generations? What has to be true about it? The mutation.
it has to cause some kind of reaction within the environment based off of the thing that's being mutated. So like, for instance, the example about long beak versus short beaks, if the mutation turned out that it was a short beak, sometimes it adapts to better a population. It might benefit pending if the food source needed or like resources, required a short beak. Or it could also hurt your population if a long beak was required and this was just like a oh my gosh, I can't say the word, like a genetic defect essentially.
Yeah, so when would a mutation be selected for, and when would it be selected against? You kind of described it already, but there's another word I'm kind of looking for.
I'm not gonna lie to you, I can't think of the word. My brain is trying to go all the way back to genetics. It's foggy.
No worries. So what I'm looking for is when a mutation occurs, it's selected for when it increases fitness or it helps feed the birds, like your example. So you were spot on. The word I was looking for is just that when it increases fitness, and it's selected against if it hinders fitness. So what's a classical example of a mutation that occurs every so often in many different species, but is generally selected against, so it's very rare to see in nature? They showed a picture of it in cockbooks with the deer.
The albino.
Yeah, exactly. So albinoism is a genetic mutation that occurs, but why is it selected against? Why don't we see it more commonly?
Because it's a well, essentially for things like deer, it would create less ability to like hide in your environment. You'd be more prone to being prey to your predators.
Right. I agree, but why is it more probable that a predator will kill it?
It's easier to see. You can't.
Exactly, right? It causes it to have poor camouflage, other than maybe in the snow at times, but throughout the year, depending on where they live, a lot of deer don't see a ton of snow, some see a lot. But yeah, in general, it's just, presumably it causes them to be more visible in their environment. They stick out, predators see them, and they get eaten more, easily and more readily. So that's why, mutations happen. We see it occasionally. They survive for a little while, but usually they don't live very long because of predators, exactly. And the one thing that I was looking for earlier too is that it's a change in genetic material, like we talked about, but it's also heritable, right? So if the mutation occurs, it changes your genetic makeup that you can actually pass that on.
Yeah, would that depend on your like autosomal dominant or recessive genes too?
Yes, an albino deer will not automatically give birth to all albino deers, but it can. It has a higher probability because it has that gene now. It's a recessive gene, but it's a higher probability if you have it at all. So.
Okay.
But if it turns into like a dominant gene, then yes, you can see it more frequently. So.
Okay.
But just the key there is that it is heritable. All right, and what about migration? What does that do for genetic variation between populations?
Homogenizes them,
Yep. So what do we mean by that?
that it makes their genetics like less different. It makes them more similar.
Yeah, so it reduces variation between the populations, right? So if you have two populations and the individuals are moving between, they're going to share genes, share alleles, and they're going to homogenize and be very similar. Versus if you have two populations that are isolated, say it's two islands of lizards, and they can't swim, so they can't get to each other. How would they potentially move apart from each other? What would cause them to differ?
Adaptation to their local environment.
Yeah, exactly, right? So local selection factors. There might be different predators, different food sources, different resources available. So there's all sorts of different selection pressures that could cause them to move directionally away from one another. Or one island gets hit by a storm and the other island doesn't, and that disrupts the allelic variation on the island. And then because of genetic drift, you now have two differing populations of the same species maybe, but their genetics are a little bit different. And even their morphology, their genotypes that we see could be different. So one thing we haven't really talked about much are life history traits. So what do we mean when we say life history traits? What does that describe for the organism?
A lot of that would be like how quickly they reproduce or how big they grow or how many offspring they have.
Yeah, exactly, right? So we can think of it as a schedule of the organism's life, right? So a schedule for how they grow, how they develop, how they reproduce, and how they survive. So we think about growth, like you said, do they grow quickly? Do they grow slowly? Do they grow to a large size? Do they grow to an intermediate, to a small size? And we think of development, do they develop into sexual maturity when they're young, an intermediate age, or a late stage? And then survival, which we think about their longevity, right? Do they live a long life, or do they live a relatively short life? And reproduction, another thing to think about is not only age of sexual maturity, but also how many offspring they have, how big their offspring are, what level of parental care they give their offspring. So those are all descriptors inside or for an organism's life history.
Would gestation periods be another example of life history?
Yep, that'd be great. That would fit under reproduction as well. Yeah, there's a lot of things that can fit under like the kind of key headlines that they talked about. The main ones they said were, growth, development, reproduction, and survival. But each one of those has many factors within them. So exactly, that's awesome. So another topic that Cogbooks goes over, kind of building off of this, is a principle of allocation. So what do we mean when we talk about principle of allocation?
How organisms essentially spend their metabolic and time resources, like whether or not they spend it on growth or reproduction.
Yeah, exactly. We can think of this in terms of a pie, right? And you can cut this pie up into multiple slices, and each slice is exactly what you described. There's a slice for reproduction, a slice for growth and development, a slice maybe for like competition, and they have to put these resources, just energy that comes from the food that they ingest, they have to allocate it to specific slices. And depending on the age and timeline of this organism, those slices might be different sizes. So for a young organism, they're going to allocate very little resources to reproduction, other than maybe the growth of their reproductive organs. They're going to allocate a lot more energy into survival, feeding, and development and growth. Versus an organism that does reach its reproductive stage, it's going to shift those pie slices and allocate energy to a different amounts, now more to reproduction. When an organism reaches its total, its largest body size, it doesn't allocate a lot of energy to growth anymore. Maybe some energy still to maintenance and some energy to recovery if it, say, gets in a violent interaction with another organism, but it's not growing anymore, so it doesn't need as many resources to that. So that those resources can be allocated to something else, such as hunting or reproduction. And what does it ultimately, what's the big picture that this organism wants to maximize by allocating its resources to specific needs? What is it trying to maximize?
It's fitness.
Yep, exactly. So it wants to allocate its resources adequately and appropriately that it maximizes its fitness. And as we said, depending on its life stage and its reproductive status, those allocation percentages are going to change to maximize its fitness. So we want to go into one of them in more detail that the Cogbooks covered. It talks about the cost of reproduction. What are some of the choices that an organism has to make in its reproduction? Both, it can make a conscious choice for some of these, and some of it is more physiological response. What are some conscious choices that organisms tend to make, considering their reproduction?
Is parental investment considered conscious?
Yeah, I would argue it would definitely lean in that direction. That's what I'm meaning by conscious. So parental care is one of the choices an organism can make. It can choose to invest heavily in its offspring, so a lot of time and energy. It can choose to invest kind of intermediate, where it maybe prepares them to build a nest maybe to kind of protect them, or it could have no parental care, where as soon as it it lays its eggs and it abandons them. So it's there's no parental care involved in it. What are some of the positives and negatives to parental care? Why would parental care be beneficial?
In a way, they can ensure that the next generation survives at least to a point where they can fend for themselves.
Yeah, exactly, right? So they help them by feeding them, they protect them, it really increases their chances of surviving. What's a negative or a consequence, like a cost to parental care?
You're, as a parent, more susceptible to, and you're more prone to like prey, essentially like the easiest way I can describe it is like, say a parent's trying to like hunt for food, they are more susceptible to getting eaten by prey, by like predators, and not being able to make it back when those offspring depend on you as a parent to survive.
Sure, so just makes you more vulnerable to predators. If you're feeding your offspring, are you also feeding yourself?
Not all the time.
Yeah, so you have to allocate some of the resources that you gather to your offspring, so it can cost you body condition. There's a lot of animals that after breeding season are in pretty poor body condition because they beat themselves up and didn't feed themselves as well in order to provide for their offspring. Also, what about the number of offspring? How does that relate to parental care?
Sometimes, especially what I see in dogs, if they have too many in a litter, they can actually have like what we humans call preeclampsia, but they can have eclampsia, and that can cause problems with their calcium levels. And it can actually put them in stages of like shock, and they can actually die from it.
Yeah, that's a really good example. And the point I was getting at, it fits that. It's you can only be spread so thin as a parent, right? You can't have 10,000 dogs or puppies from one dog, because that dog couldn't physically produce enough energy to produce that, and it also wouldn't have the ability to provide for that many offspring. So the point is it limits the number of offspring we can have. Generally, when you have high levels of parental care, you produce higher quality offspring, but fewer offspring. If you think of other organisms like spiders, where they make an egg nest and they have hundreds or thousands of offspring and provide very little parental care, they can have tons of offspring, but the chances of each of those individual offspring surviving are pretty low, because they have to fend for themselves as soon as they hatch out of the egg, if they even make it out of the egg.
So kind of piggybacking off of that, off of the amount of energy that parents should invest, can you just go over number 15? Because that kind of goes off of that.
It says, given a relationship between an offspring's energy and its survival, predict the optimal amount of energy that a parent should invest in each offspring. So that again goes back to the activity kind of that we were going over earlier, but asking it in a slightly different way. Let me pull those up and see if I can find that question. Okay, let me share my screen quick. Okay, so that goes back to these types of charts. And if we just go back to this one real quick, so this is the minimum amount of energy, right? That's right here. That's this point, the minimal that can be invested. But if we say, what was your question? It was 15. Sorry, let me. This one. Given a relationship between an offspring's energy and its survival, predict the optimal amount of energy that a parent should invest in. Okay, so this is finding the optimal amount of energy. So energy invested per offspring, so that we want to find the x-axis value that optimizes survival, right? You know, if we look at this chart, we could say, well, it wants to be up here because this is the highest survivorship, right? So it should maybe do this. But with cogbooks, it explains that that's not the best choice because that's actually, it's not optimal because the curve has declined so much over here that it's no longer increasing at a like rate of appreciation. This is actually where we want to find that tangent point, or the what is it? Yeah, the tangent of the straight line drawn to it right here. So that goes back to right here, the optimal temperature or temperature. The optimal amount of energy invested for offspring would be at this tangent point, and we draw a line down, and that would be right here at around 100. That make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, I know I butchered that a little bit in the middle, sorry, but I think we got to the point eventually.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so it's the inflection point where we can draw that tangent line, would be the optimum amount because it's increasing up to that point, and then after that, it's no longer a good, it would be a better investment to invest in a second offspring than it would to continue to invest in a single offspring. So that's kind of that trade-off, is at what point do we say the first offspring is good and it's better to start a second offspring than to continue on that first offspring, would be another way to think about that question or phrase it.
Okay. So that kind of like, that's kind of just like putting a chart to what we were talking about earlier, essentially how like animals can only, you know, produce strong offspring. They usually have less offspring versus like, basically that's kind of just like putting that into a chart, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. So if she only has 100 kilojoules to invest, the answer would be to make an optimal offspring, she would make 1. If she has 200, she can make 2, right? Or no, 100 would give us, yeah, if it was 100, it would be 1. Yeah, sorry. And 200 would give us 2 offspring in this specific example.
Okay.
And if it was like 210, we would say the answer probably would still be 2, because it would be 2.1, but you can't make 0.1 offspring. She'd be better off putting that 0.1 into both of the offspring that she's making, rather than try to make a third one and divide 210 by 3. She would produce 3 suboptimal offspring.
Okay. Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay, that's pretty much, I think we covered most of the material, which is great. That's really all I have for the group, but if you know anybody here has any more questions, we can continue for a little bit.
I don't think I have any more questions.
Okay.
I don't have any more. Thank you.
Okay. Awesome. I think we can go ahead and call it a session then, and I will get on uploading this to our Canvas page. And I guess just to, that reminds me, I did want to do that at the beginning, but I forgot. I just want to go over, well, actually, I don't know if that's going to help if people can't find it, showing them how to find it. So I'll make an announcement about it rather than show it, because yeah, that makes more sense. Okay, well, I want to thank everybody for joining and asking your questions. I'm sure your classmates that couldn't attend but will watch this later will appreciate it as well.
Thank you so much.
No problem.